What if Destiny 2 stopped being a full live service? And I think that is a solid question to ask because at this point, I'm not exactly sure that the live service model is really working for Destiny. Where was our peak here? We got about 58,000 players here, average per day in September 2023. And then over the course of the last few months in January, it dropped all the way down to 39,000 players. And in the last 30 days, only 36,000 players. When you think about it being only on Steam, it's pretty likely that the numbers are very similar across the other platforms as well. Interest in Destiny has fallen off hard, and while we did have a nice peak here in December of 2023, it pretty much immediately fell back off. But we're going to go ahead and read some of this article. It says, everyone has been chasing Destiny all these years, but of course Destiny 2 has had severe struggles this year, with falling player counts and revenue, resulting in widespread layoffs. And if you guys don't know, they missed their counts by a pretty large margin there. You consider 45%. They weren't even close, dude. Like, it wasn't even a little bit close for Destiny in terms of the money that they should have made. And that, it feels bad, but at the same time, at a certain point, you gotta expect it. You gotta learn that you can't just do the same thing over and over again and expect for people to still care over the course of several years. It says, now we're headed into the final expansion of the current saga and the launch of seasonal but not seasonal episodes after that. And the episode model, we're not quite sure what that is yet, but it'll be coming with the final shape. So if it's good, then good. And if it's not good, then we'll know pretty quickly because players will try it and then they'll fall right back off like they did here in the previous months. And if you look at the players back in March of 2023, which is when the Lightfall expansion came out, the average players per day was up to 135,000. Very impressive number. And I can't get this ad to go away. God damn it, Lexus, I'm trying to make a point to chat here. But anyway, in March of 2023, the concurrent numbers per day were at 135,000. And then you fast forward roughly 1 year, 10 months, and the numbers have dropped 100,000 players per day. That is not surprising in the least, when Bungie has done the exact same thing with their seasonal model for a very, very long time. There's very little change that has actually happened here. The article goes on, it says, I do wonder if it's possible to just stop all this, to go back to the brief period of time where Destiny was a series that was not cranking out non-stop content all year with never-ending seasons, allowing for breaks for players to breathe, and perhaps easing up a bit on the relentless seasonal development at Bungie as well. And while that model would not take away the falling player counts as time goes on, what it would do is allow for a very serious rise in the player count in between, because they would consume the content, they would enjoy the content, presumably they would enjoy the content, right? And then they would immediately fall back off after they had consumed the content that they wanted to actually play, instead of kind of being forced into this fear of missing out situation where Bungie creates these abstract hurdles for you to kind of jump over to get to the part of the game that you want to play or the reward that you are trying to chase. And because of that, it's obvious in the player count numbers, right? In just a single month, going from 135,000 in March of 2023 down to 87,000 in April of 2023. And that's kind of the dip that we would expect were we to move to where the episode model would be, hey, we give you this big batch of content, players do the content, and then they leave and go play something else until it's time for more content to come out. You would expect to see a 35%, a 40%, a 45% dip in player count in that regard, but players would come back en masse and experience the content each time a release had come out. Paul says, the idea I have would be to make the game continue to produce content, but escape from the true live service model that it embodies now, burning out, I think, everyone involved at this point. I think you keep the large-scale expansions, those, when good, are the best parts of Destiny, and introduce meaningful content to the game, even if, yes, Lightfall missed hard this year. I mean, it's no argument, right? Lightfall obviously missed. It missed its mark in terms of what the narrative could have been and how players received the narrative overall. I think that Witch Queen is indicative of a story that players really want to see out of Destiny. The Witch Queen campaign is some of the best Destiny content I think a lot of us have ever played, and certainly the most lore-filled, story-driven, narrative-based content that any of us have ever seen from the franchise. And I think a lot of us were expecting more of that with Lightfall, and what we ended up getting was kind of like a jumbled mess of what could have been a story, but ended up just being a bunch of memes about the Veil, and Strand not being fully introduced until essentially the end of the entire campaign, but kind of dick-teased along the way over and over again, and never actually getting to experience the full kit for yourself, but kind of just thrown into these spots where you were forced to use the subclass. And even for the last boss, where you fought against, spoiler alert, where you fought against Callus at the end of the Lightfall campaign, and you were forced to use Strand essentially in that encounter, unless you decided that you didn't want to, but the encounter was based around you being able to use it, and it didn't give you access to any of the aspects or the fragments, so the idea that this subclass was being introduced never really fully got realized until after we had already completed what was supposed to be the large chunk of story-driven content that we got last year. The article says, it seems the pacing of that is more likely every 18 months rather than every year now, but I'm not sure that's a problem. And honestly, it's not. If Bungie wanted to, they could push back these yearly expansions to every 18 months, and it wouldn't be a problem as long as the expansion delivered on the promise that we had set out for to begin with. As long as the narrative gets pushed forward in a meaningful way, and we're hit with these story beats along the way that not only make sense, because the Lightfall campaign, a lot of it just didn't make sense or was too nebulous to people. If you do it in the right way, like the Witch Queen campaign did, you can set up not only villains, but you can set up the story behind villains, you could set up the backstory for the overarching plot of the year to come, and you cannot miss the mark in a serious way, which, looking at the player counts, it's obvious that Lightfall did, but then when you go back a year, you can see that the player counts never really reached peaks as high as the Lightfall launch. So I think this is indicative of players being hungry for these large yearly expansions so that they can really experience that gigantic chunk of what it is to play Destiny. These 8-mission, very long campaigns, we're talking about like 10, 15-hour long campaigns, depending on how long it takes you to complete these missions. And that is seemingly, at least according to the player count, what people want to see the most. The article continues on, then the idea would be that instead of 4 seasons a year, or even this new idea of 3 episodes, you would just do real DLC again, which is exactly what I've been talking about. Something smaller than an expansion, but substantive and interesting enough to get players playing again. Paul says, during this time, sure, Bungie would no doubt continue to stock Eververse with items. They'd continue to have holiday events and such. You could do minor updates here and there, like, hey, here are some PvP maps, which would be nice. And I'll be honest, I don't think anybody really expects us to get PvP maps beyond what was already announced at this point. It has been so long, it's been so many years, that a lot of the player population for PvP, the people who were possibly most passionate about the game, aren't even playing Destiny anymore to begin with. So it kind of pulls up a question like, if Bungie had continued supporting PvP in a serious way, instead of putting it on the back burner and kind of letting it, I don't want to say that it died, but it certainly fizzled from a boil down to a simmer. If they support PvP, would these players come back and continue to play Destiny? Because for me, Destiny PvP was the best part of the entire franchise. It was the reason to come and play the game every single day. I loved Destiny 1 Trials of Osiris. I even loved PvP in the first iteration of it in Destiny 2. It wasn't my favorite overall, but it was still Destiny PvP, and it hits hard for a player like me who has the most fun in an environment that is constantly changing, as opposed to PvE, where the encounters are scripted, and every time the same thing happens. Every location, every enemy spawn, everything is exactly the same in PvE. So if Bungie had supported it better, I think a lot of the population fall off would have slowed down at least, and we would still be seeing higher player count numbers than we are today. The article goes on, but these sprawling, endless seasons that fans end up complaining about anyway, this has not felt sustainable for a while now. It says we are now in a place where seasons often have really good content, but players are burned out regardless, and the entire model doesn't seem like it's working anymore. I don't think episodes are going to change that, and And while I can't agree or disagree with that because I don't know what episodes are going to be, and they haven't announced what we can actually expect from these episodes, I do think that if it isn't some kind of substantial narrative push each time an episode comes out, or sets up a new story that we then get to work all the way through as though it were a miniature version of a larger DLC, I don't see how episodes solve this problem at all.